we're talking about persuasion. And persuasion is the process by which a message induces change in beliefs, attitudes, or behaviors. Now, efforts to persuade can be good or bad. The bad we tend to call propaganda, the good we tend to call education. Now, education is, however, more factually based and less coercive than propaganda. Since persuasion is everywhere, social psychologists seek to understand what leads to effective, long-lasting attitude change. We're going to start out talking about what specific paths lead to persuasion. We're then going to go on and talk about the different elements of persuasion. And then finally, we will end up by talking about how can you resist persuasion. So starting out, what paths lead to persuasion? Well, we typically recognize the central route and the peripheral route. The central route is typically used when people are motivated and able to think about an issue. They focus on the argument. And if the arguments are strong and compelling, persuasion is likely. If the message offers only weak arguments, thoughtful people will notice that the argument's not very compelling and they will counter-argue. For example, when I was serving as a CASA volunteer, one of the parents was making an argument, or kinship parents was making an argument that a child should be removed from somebody else's home because the home was in a high crime area with many sex offenders, which in itself was a pretty weak argument. The judge responded and said, would you have us remove all children who live in this area? It wasn't a rational, it wasn't a good logical argument. And so because the judge was actually paying attention, using the central route, paying attention to the actual argument itself, it was not effective. The peripheral route, however, tends to be used if we're distracted, uninvolved, or busy. And this is what happens essentially. We may use this if we don't take the time to reflect on the message's content or argument. Rather than analyzing whether the arguments are compelling, we may follow the peripheral route to persuasion. We may focus on cues that trigger automatic acceptance without much thinking. Much consumer behavior, for example, which ice cream brand to buy, is made without thinking. And billboards and TV commercials, media that consumers are able to take in for only a brief amount of time, typically use peripheral routes, the peripheral route with visual images as peripheral cues, whereas things like magazine prescription drug ads, which individuals can study for a long time, seldom feature Hollywood stars or great athletes. They're actually going to offer customers information on benefits and side effects. So if we process the information quickly and we don't have long to focus on it, the peripheral route is the way to go. Now we have, however, found some differences between these two routes. Central route processing often swiftly changes explicit attitudes, whereas peripheral route processing more slowly builds implicit attitudes through repeated associations between an attitude object and an emotion. So it takes longer to build a attitude and to persuade somebody using the peripheral route. The different paths actually can be used for different purposes too. The ultimate goal of the persuader is not to have people pay attention to the message and then move on. Typically, the goal is to change behavior, whether it's buying a product, getting somebody to study, getting somebody to wear a face mask, for example. And Petty and colleagues found that the central route of processing can actually lead to more enduring change than the peripheral route. When people think deeply rather than superficially, any changed attitude will likely persist, resist, attack, and influence behavior. But none of us has the time to thoughtfully analyze all issues. We may use heuristics, things like trust the experts, long messages are credible, and we all make snap judgments using such heuristics. If a speaker is articulate and appealing, has good motives, and has several arguments, we usually take the peripheral route and accept the message without much thought. Central route appeals seem to have dwindled in recent years, in part because advertisers have found that peripheral route appeals are more effective across a variety of products. In one study, for example, the viewer's facial expressions were better indicators of product sales than how persuasive they found the ad. In other words, they asked people, how persuasive was this ad? How likely are you to change your behavior as a result of seeing it? That was actually less that did not work as well to predict how the product was going to do than it did actually examining people's facial expressions when they were watching the ad, which suggests that emotion, not reason, is what sold the goods.